Good morning, all of you. We'll continue with Mother's Day, page number 45. Okay, so we are at the place where Mrs. Pearson, she tells George, her husband, that they laugh at the club. Everyone they laugh at you, and you should have found it out by now. Means anyone in your place, he would have found it by now. And you are one of their standing jokes. Means you are a regular source of amusement for them, and they call you Pompey Pearson. Pompey Pearson, because he was very slow to move, and then very pompous, self-centered, and self-important and arrogant. And so George is horrified, and he's like that, no, never. Obviously they don't laugh at me. And now Mrs. Pearson, she is not bothering what he is responding back. She says that, and it I have never been able to understand that why you want to go to a place, and spend so much time there, where they are always laughing behind your back and they are calling you names. And for doing that, you leave your wife at home night after night, and instead, you should have gone out with her, and obviously, then you wouldn't have made a big fool out of yourself. And so, at this moment, Cyril, he enters from the right. He had a glass of milk in one hand and a thick slice of cake in the other. And George, when he listens to all this, and he is almost dazed, and he turns to Cyril appealingly, means that, see what your mother is saying. And George asks Cyril that, hey Cyril, you only tell me, you have been with the club, you have been with me at the club once or twice, and they don't laugh at me and call me names. Do they call me Pompey Pearson? Do they? And Cyril, he is embarrassed. He doesn't know what to say to his father, and so he hesitates, and that makes George angry, and he says, go on, tell me, do they? And so Cyril, obviously, how can he say that to his father? And so he's like, well, yes dad, I'm afraid so. Means yes, they do call you. And George, he looks from Cyril to Mrs. Pearson, and he is staggered is no, when you walk with unsteady feet, and as if you're about to fall. So means he is staggered to know that, he's staggering after knowing that they call me this, and they have uh, been laughing behind my back for so many years, calling me names. And then, when he realizes that his family members, they also knew about it and never told him. So he's so much taken it about all this. And then he says, so, well, then I'll be damned. Damned is, when you are condemned to suffer some punishment. And so he says that, well, means this is just simply condemnation for me. And George, after this, he exits from the left side of the stage, and he walks as if someone has hit him on the head. And Cyril, after he watches him go, and he turns angrily at his mother and says that, now you shouldn't have told him that, mom, and it's not fair. You have hurt his feelings, and you have hurt mine also. So Mrs. Pearson, still not bothered by what all they are saying. Now, she is here to teach them a lesson, and she is all gun blazing. And she says, sometimes it is good, it does good to people to get their feelings hurt. And and one thing more, the truth, it doesn't hurt for long. And then she says, if your father hadn't been going to the club so often, maybe they wouldn't have laughed at him so much. So to that, Cyril says, I doubt it. Means I don't think so that if he'd go less, then they will not laugh at him so much. And so Mrs. Pearson, she very severely says, maybe, possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinions. And then she says, what I doubt is that whether it is any your opinion. Your opinion is not even worth having. I don't even need your opinion. Why are you giving your opinion to me? And then she says, what do you know? You know nothing. You yourself spend so much time and money at that those greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. So obviously, to me, your opinion means nothing, because you obviously know nothing. Now, greyhounds. Anyone? Any idea what a greyhounds? Ever heard the name greyhound? No, it is a dog breed, all right. Tall, slender dogs, and they are capable of very high speed, and that is why they're used for hunting and racing. So he has been spending a lot of his time and money on these races. And so Cyril, he says that, well, what if I do? Means, okay, I accept that, but what if I do? And then I have got to enjoy myself somehow. Means, even I need to have something for my enjoyment. So Mrs. Pearson, she says, like a true mother, she says, I wouldn't have mind so much if really you were having some fun or you were enjoying yourself. But are you really enjoying yourself? And see, where is it getting you? Means, like, mothers really are, they know everything about the children, and so she also knows. Cyril, he doesn't know. He thinks that he is doing it all for his enjoyment, but mother knows well, and she says that you're doing it, but are you really enjoying it all? Does it really bring you some happiness? And then see, where is it getting you? And at that moment, there's a hurried knocking at the door. And so Cyril says that maybe it's someone for me, so I'll go and see. And then he hurries from the left door, and in a moment he re-enters and he closes the door. So there's a knocking. He goes out to see who is it, and then he again comes back without that person, closes the door, and then he says to a mother, it's that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fitzgerald, and you don't want her here, do you? And so, silly old bag, it is an insulting word for an old woman. So he calls her, see, etiquettes, manners not right, and he calls a neighbor silly old woman. And then he also says that, I don't think so you want her here, do you? And Mrs. Pearson, she does not like it and says, certainly I do, you ask her in. And then next time, from next on onwards, don't dare call her silly old bag. And she's a very nice woman, and she has a lot of more sense than you will ever have in your life, so don't call her that. And so Cyril, he's scolded, he's rebuked, and so he exits from the left door. And Mrs. Pearson, she finishes the stout which she was having, and after that she smacked her lips. When you have something delicious, after having it, like, we move our lips, we move our tongue over our lips, so she smacks her lips. And then Cyril, he re-enters and he is ushering in. When there's a guest at your house, so obviously, from the door, from the gate, you usher that person in. So Cyril, he ushers in Mrs. Fitzgerald. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, now you need to remember, she has Mrs. Pearson's spirit in her. So now she's that nervous type, and so she hesitates in the doorway. And so Mrs. Pearson, she says, come in, Mrs. Fitzgerald." And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is very anxious, because she was very as to what would have happened here, because she wanted to put her family right, but obviously, she did not have it in her, and she was afraid that she'll be able to do that or not. And so that is why, they change their places, they change bodies. And so now she was anxious, and she says that, I just wondered, I was thinking that is everything all right? And so to that, Cyril replies that no, it isn't, everything is not right. And Mrs. Pearson, she sharply cuts him and says, of course it is. And here she tells Cyril to be quiet. And Cyril, he's like, why should I be quiet? And so Mrs. Pearson, now she shouts and tells him, because I am telling you to, you silly spoilt young pekin. Pekin, again, a word used for foolish person. So she says that you be quiet, because I am telling you to be quiet. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald, at this, she protests nervously. Oh no, surely, because maybe she has never disciplined her children in that manner, and that is why, they are so mannerless, and they don't know how to talk in front of a stranger or a guest. And not a stranger but a guest. And the way they talk to their mother and all that. So now that is why they are behaving like this. And now when Mrs. Pearson, who has Mrs. Fitzgerald spirit, now when she is rebuking them and then also reprimanding them for doing bad or wrong, so Mrs. Fitzgerald, because inside her now we really have Mrs. Pearson spirit, so she's like, oh no, surely means don't be like that. And so Mrs. Pearson, she very civilly says to her, so now Mrs. Fitzgerald, you let me manage my family in my own way, and please, okay. So Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, yes, but Cyril means you are scolding him. So Cyril, when Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, but Cyril, they have proper way of addressing there. This is set up in London, and so the people you don't know very well, so they use proper terms of addressing like here. And that is why Cyril says also, Mrs. Cyril Pearson to you, means not Cyril, not on first name basis, because first name used for people, family members and friends. And so he says that when she says but Cyril, so obviously she cannot, a neighbor cannot call him that, and so he says that no, it is Mr. Cyril Pearson to you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And saying that, Cyril, he goes into the kitchen. Now Mrs. Fitzgerald, she moves to the settee and she whispers, oh dear, what's happening? So Mrs. Pearson, very calmly, she says, nothing much, just putting them in their places, that's all, doing what you ought to have done long since. And so when Mrs. Fitzgerald asks her that what is happening, and so she says, nothing much, I'm just simply putting them in their right places. What you have done, what you should have done long back, I'm doing it today. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she asks, is George home? So she sits beside Mrs. Pearson on the settee, and so Mrs. Pearson, she says, yes, he's back, and I've been telling him what they think about him at the club. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, well, they think a lot of him, don't they? Means they think him quite important, don't they? So Mrs. Pearson said, no, they don't. And he knows it, means now he knows what the people at the club really think about him. Okay. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is getting nervous. Oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so she says, means I don't think so. You should have told him, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Now she is in Mrs. Fitzgerald body, and she is calling Mrs. Annie Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald. Obviously, she is calling because they have switched the spirits. And so Mrs. Pearson is like, nonsense, I am doing all of them a lot of good, and very soon they'll be eating out of your hands, means they'll do everything you say. And so Mrs. Fitzgerald is like, no, I don't want them eating out of my hands. So Mrs. Pearson, she because she has a Mrs. Fitzgerald spirit, so she's impatiently says, well, whatever it is you want, they'll be doing just that, and all three of them, mark my words, Mrs. Pearson. And so at this point, George, he enters from the left. He is glum, he is sad, and he is surprised, but in an unpleasant manner. So he's unpleasantly surprised. He did not like the visitor. And when he sees a visitor, so he moves to the armchair which is on the left, and he sits down heavily, and glumly, sadly, he lights his pipe, and then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is regarding him anxiously. And now he looks from one to the other, and Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is looking at Mr. Pearson in a very nervous, anxious, worried manner. So George says, just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so George says that, I think you were here just for a minute, Mrs. So now Mrs. Fitzgerald, who doesn't know what she's saying, and Mrs. Fitzgerald is, she is not realizing, she does not realize Mrs., because obviously it is Mrs. Annie Pearson's spirit, so she does not realize that obviously now she is in Mrs. Fitzgerald body, who is a neighbor, so she shouldn't be talking to them in that manner, as if they were her own family. And so she says, she says, what? Okay, doing them. She says, George, well, yes, I suppose so, George. And so George, when he listens, the same was the reaction of Cyril also when she calls him Cyril. So Cyril says that no, it is Mr. Cyril Pearson for you. And here, when she says that, well, yes, I suppose so, George, now she calls Mr. Pearson as George. So he is aghast, means he's like, George? And so Miss Fitzgerald, she is getting nervous. Oh, I'm sorry. So Mrs. Pearson, she's impatient. He says, what does it matter? Your name is George, na? Isn't it? And who do you think you are? The Duke of Edinburgh? So George, he gets angry. He says that what he has to got to do with that, means with it, Duke of Edinburgh. And just tell me that. And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? And so he says that, why are you bringing him into all this? And then he says that, it is already bad enough for me, means what I have got to know today, it is already so bad without her calling me George. And then no tea, Pompey Pearson, and poor Doris has been crying her eye out upstairs. Yes, crying her eyes out. And so George, now he's angry and says that, already it has been a very bad day for me. And no tea, she is calling me George. And you told me that people at the club, they laugh at me and they call me Pompey Pearson. And then on top of that, poor Doris, she is upstairs and she's crying her eyes out, means she is crying so much. Okay, so Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, oh dear, I ought to have known, means oh dear, I ought to have known, means. So Miss George is like, he stares at her and he is annoyed, means you ought to have known. Why you ought to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so when she says that, I ought to have known, obviously, what she means is that when they have changed bodies, obviously she would have known that what will Mrs. Fitzgerald's spirit do in her house. And but George, he is not able to understand, because none of them knows that they have changed bodies or they have changed spirits. And so he stares at her and not with it, what is happening in a house, what you have got to do with that, and why you ought to have known. All right, and it has nothing to do with you. And then he says, look, we are at sixes and sevens here just now, so perhaps you'll excuse us, means we are at sixes and sevens. Any idea? Sixes and sevens, what does this phrase mean? Means there's
In disagreement.
yes, there's disagreement and confusion. So he says that right now in our house we are having this confusion, disagreement, so it will be better if possibly you excuse us. What does it mean? That it will be better if you go back home. So now Mrs. Pearson, now before Mrs. Fitzgerald can reply, so Mrs. Pearson, she speaks that, George Pearson, I won't excuse you for this. And next time a friend or a neighbor, they come to see me, just say something good when you see her. Good evening, or how do you do, or something. And don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's bad manners. And so if you remember, when George entered and he sees Mrs. Fitzgerald there, he doesn't say a word. All right, no word of pleasantry, no good evening, nothing, and he simply goes on to sit on the armchair and glumly he lights up his cigar. And so now she said that, George Pearson, that was very bad of you, and I won't excuse you for that. And next time, if my some friend or neighbor, they come to see me, and then you say something good when you see them, all right, like good evening or how do you do, and or something like that. And don't just simply march in without saying a word, and it is bad manners. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she is getting nervous. No, it's all right. So Mrs. Pearson, no, it's not all right, and now we'll have some decent manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. And so she says that, well, now I don't want all this, I want proper decent manners to be followed in my house, and or I'll know the reason. And then she says, otherwise I will know the reason why. And she glares at George. So she says, well, So George, now he's intimidated. Uh, he's scared a little, and he says, well, what? So Mrs. Pearson, she taunts him and says, why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? And they'll be waiting for you, waiting to have a good laugh. Go on them, don't disappoint them. And so, she is being very severe to George and says that, well, why don't when he talks like that, and so she says, okay, why don't you go to your club, all right, and special night tonight, and they all be waiting for you, waiting to have fun at your cost, all right, so why not go, why disappoint them? And so George, he is bitter, and he's like, that's right, okay, go on, make me silly in front of her also. Means still now you have been making fun of me, calling me names, and now in front of a neighbor also you are doing that. And so he says, okay, that's right, make me look silly in her eyes also, go on, don't mind me. And then sixes and sevens means, he says, sixes and sevens means there's so much confusion and disagreement, and poor Doris, she has been crying her eyes out, and getting and then he's like, see, and even getting the neighbors into our family business, getting neighbors in to see the fun. And then he says, even now, not only it is our family members, but it is also the neighbors who are here, and who are getting all the fun out of our disagreement and confusion. And so suddenly he loses his temper, and he glares at, means look severely at Mrs. Pearson, and shouts, all right, let them hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone balmy or what? And so he is now like, okay, it's all right. Now let us all hear it. And what is wrong with you? Have you gone balmy? Have you gone crazy, mad, or what? So now Mrs. Pearson, she jumps up savage in a very wild manner, and just, if you shout at me like that again, George Pearson, I'll slap your big fat silly face. And now Mrs. Fitzgerald, because she has Mrs. Pearson's spirit, and she's like, oh no, 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 please, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And Mrs. Pearson sits. So now Mrs. Fitzgerald is calling Mrs. Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald. So George, he stares at her, astonished, bewildered, and he's like, either I am off my chump, or you two are. Means either I am out of my mind, I am crazy insane, or both of you are. And how, means what do you mean? No, no, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald, look, you are. And he said that, why you are calling her Fitzgerald? It is you who are Mrs. Fitzgerald. And so why you are telling yourself to stop when you are doing nothing? And you need to tell her to stop, then there'll be some sense in it. And so he stares at Mrs. Pierce, and says, I think you must be tiddly. Tiddly means, slightly drunk. And so, when Mrs. Fitzgerald called Mrs. Annie Pearson as Mrs. Fitzgerald, and so he's like, means why you are calling her Mrs. Fitzgerald? You are Mrs. Fitzgerald, and why you are telling yourself to stop? You need to ask her to stop, then obviously there'll be some sense in it. And I think either I have gone insane mad, or you people have gone mad and insane. And then he stares at Mrs. Pierce and says, I think you have got drunk now. So Mrs. Pearson, she again starts, and again in a wild tone says, say that again, George Pearson. And so George, he's scared. He said, all right, all right, all right, I'm saying nothing. Okay, so we'll stop here for today. Have you understood what we have done today? Is it clear to all of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you enjoying this play?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.